Hey guys and girls, Bored Now back with you, and on this video I'm gonna be talking about the movie Twister from 1996, no connection to the game. So this movie is directed by Jan Dumbot, who also directed Speed, his other most famous film, which was a big hit couple of years before this, about 1994, and it sort of led to him being one of those, I think, kind of big, potentially big Hollywood directors who would go on to have a really strong career. And it didn't quite work out like that in this. In the end, I think he had a couple of like duds after this, after Twister, that is, in terms of box office. And yes, some of his films, I think, post this aren't as highly as regarded, but certainly at the time he was on a bit of a roll. So when it comes to the plot, there's not a lot to spoil really. It's a pretty basic kind of disaster movie type plot. And you have the two leads, Bill Paxton, who sadly passed away a few years ago, prematurely, really fine actor, and also Helen Hunt, who plays the other lead. And the Helen Hunt character you actually see briefly at the beginning as a kid, because the movie jumps back to 1969, which is part of the setup in the movie, because you get this like massive sort of twister tornado which attacks this farmhouse and this family, and really sort of dramatic opening where the family rush. They've got one of these like shelters, one of these like kind of places where you can go underneath, underground sort of thing, if there is like something like this, and they rush underground, and the father, as he's trying to like close the door, is like dragged out and blown away, and essentially that's it for him. And that's sort of the setup, and then we cut to the present day, and we learn later in the film that was Helen Hunt as a young girl, and she lost her father basically. So that sort of gives her like motivation, where tornadoes, twisters have become like an obsession in her life, where she now does it as I'm not sure if it's meant to be a hobby, or just that. I mean, it's a passion of hers, but I'm not sure whether she does it as a career, so to speak. But she does work on twisters. She like researches them. She tries to develop like technology for them, and she's together with this group. I think it's certainly suggested in the film that they do it non-professionally, so they're not being paid, but they do it as a way to try and warn the public and try and come up with newer, more advanced technology that can read the signs and can, warn, so that they can use that to help improve the way twisters are like people react to them, so to speak, and as a way to warn the public. So because of what like tragically happened to her father when she was a kid, Jo, played by Helen Hunt, has sort of made it her life sort of passion really to just understand twisters, to get to know them better, and to kind of pass that knowledge on to the public, and try and make a difference almost. But there's also like this sort of, it borders on a spiritual connection, I think, at times, just because of what a profound and shocking moment that was for her as a kid. And we have her and Bill Paxton's character, who's also called Bill, which is sort of handy. And they had previously been together. In fact, they've been married, and they've not too long gotten a divorce. Well, they haven't got a divorce actually. That's part of the plot of the movie. But they've recently separated, and they're kind of on the verge of getting a divorce. And Bill has like a new girlfriend played by Jamie Gatz, who sort of familiar faces, particularly in 80s movies. She's probably best known still for The Lost Boys back in the 80s. So she plays Bill's new girlfriend, or recent girlfriend, and they drive up to so that he can basically get Joe to sign the divorce papers so they can finalise it and they move on with their lives. But obviously Joe and her crew are out like developing and researching a potential tornado, and lo and behold, of course, that's what the movie's about. A twister or tornado does strike, and Bill kind of gets drawn into it once again because he previously, as well as being married to Joe, also he worked with her previously in this field. It sort of became his passion as well. So we get this sort of plot where he's being Bill is drawn into his old way of life, and we see that he still has that passion, that interest in tornadoes, and you sort of get this kind of slow burn type romance type thing where he's going to realise he still wants his old way of life, and he's still kind of interested in Joe, or certainly still has feelings for her. And obviously his new girlfriend, Melissa, her name is, the Jamie Gatz character, is kind of dragged along for the ride, and you get these various sort of characters. But yeah, they're obviously trying to get to the twister, trying to find a way to ultimately stop it, because it builds towards the end of the movie where you get an F5 twister, which is like, according to the movie, like the most dangerous you can get. And sort of as a wrestling fan, I kind of perked up when they mentioned F5, because of course Brock Lesnar, that was like his finishing move, if you know obviously Brock Lesnar. Because actually, if you watch the move, it does have the motion of a tornado sort of thing, or you can see why it's called an F5. So that's kind of where I knew the F5 expression from. And yeah, you get these series of characters, but obviously the main focus character-wise is sort of Bill Paxton and Helen Hunt's characters. So they have it, and it's one of these movies, Twister, I always remembered fondly because I watched it growing up, and it's on TV a lot, so I've probably seen it 2 or 3 times, probably before this actually, but it has been a few years, so I've not watched it recently, and I thought it'd be a good one to revisit. It's on Amazon Prime in the UK, so for anyone who's got that, it's free to check out. And the other reason I thought I'd do it is actually because they've just recently said then a remake is in the works. So I thought it'd be worth doing because of that. Now, without going into my feelings on the movie, I don't. Well, I can't really but the idea of the remake doesn't really appeal. I mean, obviously they could always freshen it up and do something a bit different, but it sort of feels like with Twister, there's not a lot that new you can do, and I think unless they did something exceptional, then I think you're unlikely to really improve on the original. But it's sort of odd because I mean, talking about well, the original Twister, it does feel very much like a throwback movie. I think it definitely has that charm, and it's sort of, I think it stands out now even more because it's the sort of movie you don't see a lot of anymore, and certainly not done very well. That's part of the problem, because it's a disaster movie, and back in the day, Hollywood produced a lot of good disaster movies. I mean, not just Hollywood. Obviously, you have international examples like the original Godzilla and those films. So it's one of those genres, I think, that then it is kind of universal. That there's nothing really in the culture of a disaster movie that can't be like sold abroad or stuff like that. But yeah, this feels like the sort of movie. I guess you still get it a fair bit now, but not as much as you do, and probably just to get a bit political for a moment, I think maybe it is because of 9/11, and the certain climate. I mean, I want to say that there was a spell, obviously post 9/11, where you didn't have them for a while, and then I think they probably did come back, because when it comes to Hollywood and big blockbusters, I think there is a tradition with disaster movies, and they do tend to be very sort of marketable movies just because the premises are so simple. But then I think recently they've kind of slowed down again. You don't see that many of them. One which actually I will sort of recommend just as a cheesy guilty pleasure is Hurricane Heist from a few years ago, which was a Sky production, and that was a bad movie, but it was bad in a way that I actually quite enjoyed. I think it was so bad it was actually quite entertaining. But yeah, as you've probably guessed from what I've been saying, I do enjoy Twister a fair bit. I enjoyed it at the time, and when I rewatched it tonight, I enjoyed it once again very much. And I think it's just a great example of how to do a blockbuster, how to do this sort of movie, this sort of throwback adventure disaster type movie. And it's the sort of thing where, yeah, modern Hollywood could really learn from this sort of movie. Um, and I think the reason it works so well is that it does kind of tick all the boxes that you want from a satisfying blockbuster. So it obviously does what it needs to do visually and with just the set pieces and the location. I mean, if you take that opening scene on the farm, like the flashback scene, that is actually really tense, really gripping. As the scene like builds and builds, you are really kind of on the edge of your seat, and you sort of feel something bad is going to happen as it goes on. So I think that's definitely one of the director's strong point, is he's really good at doing kind of really sort of gripping set pieces, really explosive, eye-catching like set pieces. So from a technical standpoint, I think this film is really good, and it holds up with that. Like, it hasn't really dated, even though it's over 20 years old, and some films from that era have dated, but this one really hasn't. The visual effects, I think, really hold up. Um, but at the same time, as saying that, it also gets the right balance where it's also got really likable characters. It's a fun movie with some good gags. Um, and yeah, it sort of ticks the boxes, so it's quite tense at times. It's visually good, quite a funny, entertaining movie. It's got, good pacing, and crucially, you do invest in those leads, in the Bill Paxton, Helen Hunt sort of characters and their like whole relationship. I think they're both really likable, charismatic actors, and I cared about their plot. So I do actually think it's a strength, the fact that you get that backstory at the start and you later find out, oh, okay, that happened to her father, so that's why she's got this passion, this almost disturbing sort of fascination with tornadoes. So I think her backstory and motivation actually does add to the character. Um, so I think it's a really strong movie. I think it's very entertaining and just a good, because obviously the premise is very simple, and uh, I'm not going to say there's that much depth to it or the characters, but what it does very well, and I think is a good example of how to make a very likable and entertaining disaster movie blockbuster. Um, so I do enjoy it a lot. I have very few complaints. So just talking about some of like the kind of big set pieces, I think the location work in this is really good because it's sort of set in this typical like southern type town out in the sticks, and I think the it just works really well. I think the look of the setting is really quite distinct, and also with it being like this big sort of disaster movie, I think the way they use like weather conditions is really good. Um, so at one point you get like heavy rains and winds, and you get like hail at one point. There's like this one particularly like dramatic scene where, because they have this device, this advanced device to like read weather, to like measure like tornadoes and stuff, and it's partly how they sort of draw Bill back in, because Bill originally came up with the concept for it, and then he kind of left when him and the Joe character split up. But they continue to like develop this technology which he started, and they show him it obviously when he meets them, and it's one of these cool sort of things. They call it Dorothy, like as a Wizard of Oz reference, which is kind of cool. But there's this scene where obviously you get all this hail, and where they're getting close to the tornadoes, so he has to try and tune it up, has to try and get it set up. It's on the back of the truck, and he's sort of been having hail flying at him, and sort of just clinging on, trying to get it all sort of set up. So I yeah, it's pretty cool the way they use like the weather as like set pieces and as hurdles to try and block them and create tension. You get flying cows at one point, although they say, "Oh my God, it's actually the same cow." Um, and that's really cool. I thought that effect, it did look pretty convincing, and it was like a flying cow. Um, What one scene I really like visually is then at one point they stop because they're like obviously taking a break, getting some food and stuff, but they stop and it's next to like this drive-in, and the film they're showing is actually The Shining, and so it becomes like the backdrop for when the tornado like strikes again, and that's a really cool visual sort of like moment because you've got the dramatic scenes from The Shining, so that here's Johnny scene, and it kind of builds as the tornado comes and it gets higher. You actually see Nickerson's face on the screen, and the screen kind of like explodes sort of thing eventually from the tornado as it's like getting to like the climactic scene with him and obviously the axe and stuff. So sort of cool like movie sort of reference, and it also looks really good visually. So there's a lot of fun set pieces that are really well crafted. I think they do pack them in towards the end, but I don't mind that because the film has earned that, because you do get a decent build up to it. And another one I really like actually is when Paxton and Helen Hunt are like driving towards the tornado, and they're starting to get blown about a bit. They literally like drive through a house at one point, so a house which has been like blown away and has ended up on the road. They literally have to drive through that, and that's a pretty cool sequence as well. So it is, the set pieces by and large are really good. The effects have held up, which is kind of remarkable, but it's sort of, I think that's another reason why I'm not really that interested in a remake, because it's not like the look of the film watching it now is dated. The look of the film actually holds up pretty well, and the effects are generally good. I think there's one or two moments where they're not so great, but generally speaking, the effects are really good. I think that's a strength of the director. So that would be one of my worries with a remake. I think they would just overdo the effects kind of thing, and it would become just throwing money at the screen, and you would lose the sense of the characters and the plot, and kind of just how enjoyable the original film. I think there's a real charm because it's a throwback movie to those classic disasters, but you also really root for the characters too, or at least I did, the central characters. So I'll talk a bit more about the relationships, because you've obviously got this dynamic where the Jamie like Gatz character Melissa is like this meant to be this more obnoxious sort of big town. She's like a therapist, so there's this thing where Bill has gone away from his old way of life, and he's now working as a weatherman, which is sort of perfect because it's like a different way of looking at it, but it's this safer kind of life where he's obviously out of the danger, and he sort of shows up, and there's this whole like idea of him now living this more kind of not exactly corporate but kind of upmarket sort of middle class life. Whereas when you see like these characters, so you've got Joe and you've got a bunch of like characters around her, like her crew, they're just so passionate, they just live for this, and it's almost like a thrill for them. And so the supporting cast is just a who's who. There's everyone in this, including a young Philip Seymour Hoffman. So it's kind of a double bummer because obviously Bill Paxton recently passed away last few years, and obviously tragically we lost Philip Seymour Hoffman way too early. But yeah, this was one of his early roles. He plays like one of Joe's crew, Dusty, as I said, and this really kind of nerdy sort of off the wall sort of guy, but with it being Hoffman, he really brings a lot of energy to that part as well, and you do enjoy the character. Um, Even though it's obviously not one of his like more well known or one of the parts where he's really given that much to do, you still enjoy the character for what it is. So yeah, there is this dynamic where Bill seems to be leaving his old life behind, or at least trying to, and live in this more middle class like existence. I will actually say I think a lot of people would probably rag on Jamie Gantz in the film and kind of say, oh, she's like annoying and she's not that great. She probably is the weak part, but I actually think she's alright. I think she serves her purpose. And I actually don't like the character. I actually don't hate the character too much. I think you could maybe say she maybe doesn't need to be in the film. Um, it's just that extra bit of tension. Like, obviously, it becomes a tug of war between her and Bill, and then obviously his old life, and obviously Joe. But she's actually not that unlikable, and you get some like comic relief type moments where she's being freaked out by all this stuff happening. You actually get some funny moments with her, even though she is more of a straight character and not the sort of character that you're really here to watch. But you get some funny moments with her where she's on like the phone to her clients, or her patients I should say, because she's a therapist, and she actually has one of the best lines in the movies where she's talking to one of them on the phone, and she keeps saying, or she says, whatever his name is, I think it's Clyde or someone, Clyde, I keep telling you, she didn't marry you for your penis, or at least that's not the only reason she married you, which is pretty great. But there's some funny stuff actually with her just reacting in shock to what's happening, and I actually think she's a decent enough person as a character because she does try to take an interest in this stuff, even though she is weirded out by it. And at one point, she's like really harsh on Dusty and kind of says, "You're all crazy," basically. But she actually does try to take an interest in tornadoes, and she obviously realizes that Bill has this past, so she asks questions and stuff, and she's quite good at looking like shocked and what have you. So she's not terrible, to be fair. I think she does sort of serve a purpose, and there's one or two good like scenes with her. But I think obviously the thing is, you kind of know then probably more than likely by the end of the film, like Joe and Bill are going to get together, and the thing is, you do really like them, their relationship, their sort of past. I think the way Bill interacts with the whole group, I like the fact that they call him Extreme Bill, and obviously Melissa's like, well, why do you call him that sort of thing? And then they start telling all these sort of stories, and there's just this thing about, I guess there's like this overlap with him and Joe because of her personal history, where he kind of says to, living in the past or won't bring your dad back, because there's a point where she really gets so desperate where the thing looks like it's been destroyed, and he's like, it won't bring won't bring your dad back. You've got to live for the present. And that's when he kind of like sort of comes out with his real feelings for her, because he's like, you've got me, sort of thing. And Melissa hears it over the thing. So there's this sort of crossover where she's been still haunted by her past. But at the same time, it's kind of like she is a part of his past, and Bill is almost denying his past and trying to desperately to move on from it. And yeah, there is kind of the message with that, which is kind of cool. And I think it obviously, again, there's not a lot of depth to it, but I think there are kind of, it does have this charming sort of feel where it's kind of, I think, has this like working class sort of feel to it, and this community sort of feel against the more corporate, richer sort of lifestyle. So a more harsher example is Curly L's character, who plays this sleazy like executive sort of guy who has basically lashed on to the same technology and kind of taken it, but there's this whole thing where he's like using it for his own good, and just using it for money basically, and he's really ruthless. And it's the sort of classic part that Curly Els tends to play like when he's at his best. And there's this whole sort of rivalry between him and Bill and him and Joe, and it becomes a running theme. But there is that theme to do with this group of characters, Joe and her whole group. As I said, a lot of recognisable faces. Adam Ruck's in there, for example. They are doing it for the good of people. They're doing it because they have a passion and an interest in advancing the science and finding out more about tornadoes. But they're also doing it for the good of the public, against, the more cynical way of thinking and using it in the way the Curly L's character does. So a really good cast, but I think crucially you do invest in Joe and Bill. I think Helen Hunt, Bill Paxton, they have really good chemistry. And I do really like the Joe character. I think she has this really down-to-earth, grounded, sort of bubbly personality where she is quite playful, and she messes with Bill a lot. She does tease him a little bit about his new girlfriend, but also there's an interest. Like, she doesn't push it too much. It's not like she's constantly ragging on him, and it's not like she isn't like nice to Melissa. She doesn't go out of her way to like be a bitch. So she's Helen Hunt at her best, really. I think is very likable, very sort of grounded. I think in something like As Good as It Gets, I think she's really charismatic and just very relatable and likable and appealing. She's obviously a very attractive woman with a good personality, and I think so in that film you can really see why the Jack Nicholson character would just fall head over heels for her. And it's similar in this, where I think, although the romance isn't really a big part of the film, obviously their relationship and their past is, and they're very likable on screen together. And credit to Bill Paxton, he was a really versatile actor, because a lot of his roles were obviously supporting roles and they were more villains, and he does make for an excellent villain, but he's also actually very good at being a charismatic, likable he wasn't really the lead very often, but that's sort of the more sort of heroic type figure, the more down to earth, decent sort of guy, which he plays in this. So the fact that he's so good in this, but then so good in like more sinister roles as well, sort of shows what a talented actor he was, and a really sad loss. So it's a really entertaining film. I think visually it's really great, and I think the characters are really well played, especially the lead. I think probably a small complaint is that there's probably too many characters, because Helen Hunt does have, like, her character has this big crew, and then obviously you get the crew being led by the Curly L's character. So there's almost too many characters. You don't really get to know half of them, but I think you do get this sense of a group dynamic, and I think the way they sell the whole threat of the Twister, and the way that they are like this sort of community almost as a group. At one point they stop off and they kind of talk Joe into like dropping in on like his aunt, and that Lois Smith, the actress who's been in a lot of films, she's another really good actress. But they drop in on her and have like dinner, and that's when they start talking about Bill and his past stories. But yeah, you do feel that camaraderie between them, and the sense of a bond, and the sense of a mission, the passion, because there's a lot of goofing about, but also they're really stoked up for the mission. So when they first hear about the tornado, they go flying off in their cars, and they start turning up like music, like the Hoffman character is playing like a rock track. There's some good music actually in this film. The soundtrack is really good as well. I might actually get it. There's some good stuff in it, but yeah, he's playing a rock track and getting pumped up for like the whole adventure, and then one of the others is playing like a classical track, familiar bit of music. So that's a really cool sort of scene as well. And you do like the characters. I think in another movie maybe you wouldn't be so into them, but they are really likable, and yeah, it obviously all comes together at the end. But yeah, it holds up really well. I wasn't sure if it would hold up, or whether I would like it but not as much. But I think I like it just as much. It's a very, very likable, entertaining watch. So yeah, I recommend Twister. If you've never seen it, you should check it out. It's a bit of a gem. I'm not sure if it did quite as well as Scream. Not Scream, sorry, wrong S word movie, as Speed, his previous hit, because that was a massive hit. But I think it still did well. I think it made its money back, and I think was a big hit as well. Maybe not as quite successful as Speed, and I guess maybe the way people look at it now, Twister, I don't think it quite gets the fanfare of Speed, but it's a really good film. I think, as I said before, it's a great example of how to do a blockbuster. So there you have it. That's Twister, and when it comes to rating, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Very strong, very entertaining stuff. And yeah, reminds me of sort of how good Bill Paxton was, and how great Helen Hunt. I mean, obviously she's still working, but this is one of her best roles, I think, in this film. So yeah, a lot of great characters. Well, a lot of great actors in it. You'll see familiar faces popping up anyway. But yeah, Twister, I really like it. So that's my review of Twister. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you've seen the film, then how do you think it holds up now? Are you a big fan of it? Are you not so keen on it? Let me know why, if that's the case. And maybe suggest some other classic like slightly older movies I can review, maybe from this period or going back a bit further. Just any suggestions and I'll take a look and maybe do some of them. But yeah, thanks for watching this video. Like and subscribe if you are new to the channel, and I'll be back probably with a more recent film review soon. But thanks for listening and goodbye.